Alex, one of the many recent eyewitnesses who has reached out to me, shared with me several eyewitness stories, and I will be sharing several of hers. In fact, her first one happened in early spring or summer of 2006, or maybe even the following year of 2007. There wasn't any snow left on the ground, and it was after her mother had passed on January 15th. She didn't journal it, as she thought that her sister might read it and think she was crazy or something, as she had always had boundary issues with her sister. It was dumb, but she was almost 18 and didn't think of the danger at all at the time. She began taking early morning walks without telling her father or sister. In the country, though, she did not fear coyotes or people like she should have, especially as a female, and took no protection, like a gun, knife, bear spray, etc. She wanted to stay healthy and always enjoyed being alone in nature. Well, one morning, it was a beautiful day, and she had heard the birds and everything, and it seemed normal, even though it was quite foggy. And she takes a walk down the road, and it was only a short way before heading home. Everything seemed fine until she got past a tiny pond between the house and the closest neighbors. And that's when she gets this strange feeling of being watched. And she stops to look back, and she saw this shape of what looked like a man walking behind her a ways. She didn't hear the birds anymore, and it could have just been because she was scared and they stopped walking like they realized that Alex had seen them, which scared her even more, wondering if now she could make it back without this random creep walking down the road. The neighbor, who was in his 60s and wouldn't walk behind her like this, and pretty sure he was sleeping still anyway. It was still too far back for her to make out any details, just a shadowy human figure. It looked like they had a hood on though, and it was hard to tell for sure between the fog and distance, and then after standing there, afraid of why she was seeing what looked like a man following her on the road, what seemed like a long time. Probably a couple of seconds or minutes really. He turned and his body seemed to shimmer or morph, and he jumps into the ditch, changing shape before her very eyes, bounding into the field on all fours, looking like a wolf and nothing like a human anymore, and then disappeared into the woods in the fog. She turned, ran home, and didn't go for a morning walk again for a long time after this. She hadn't ever heard of dogmen or anything, so it made what she had saw more unbelievable. She knows this sounds like something that's made up, or that's something she had possibly imagined, or like a Twilight Saga werewolf, but she had been awake long enough before her walk and wasn't drugged up or half asleep or drunk. Her father would have not stood for her to use any substance in her house anyway. And she thought of this once when a guy that she knew mysteriously tried hinting that he wasn't exactly human. She didn't mention this story to him, but never understood what joke he was trying to make. Alex's father had always been a very outdoorsy person, and though she picked up the love from him, he never told her about any tales of encountering the supernatural. As with mental health, it was just something that this side of the family wouldn't ever talk about, which is sad. Not until closer before he passed, which he then told his kids that he had seen dark shapes and figures in his room that actually were not there. But perhaps that story is for another time. Baxter's story is very similar, and like the first, very interesting. Baxter and two friends had planned a deer hunting trip on the weekend of October 24th of 1997. They had reserved a Forest Service cabin on the north end of Young's Lake. They packed up the boat, and on the morning of Friday the 24th, they departed in Juneau, a little late, but right around 1 or 2 in the afternoon, after anchoring the boat in the cove in Young's Bay at around 4 p.m. After getting all their stuff to the shore, one of the guys needed to sight his rifle. So by the time they got to the trailhead, it was now getting close to dark. The trail to the cabin and the lake is roughly 5 miles apart. So they decided to walk in the dark so they could get a good start in the morning from the cabin. They're not sure of the evening hours it took to hike this trail and didn't really pay much attention to the time. Baxter at the time had a mini mag light, and so did one of his friends. The other had a bigger 9-volt battery light, but it had a very pathetic beam. Within half an hour of starting, it was already dark. They had cloud coverage and no moonlight that they could notice. The trail was easygoing, but very winding with occasional roots to step over. At what Baxter can guess would be around mile 3, they noticed that they had a large animal walking the trail ahead of them. They naturally assumed it was a brown bear because, hey, Alaska. And they stopped for several minutes and discussed what they should do about it. They told the guy with the bigger light to keep pointing down the trail so they wouldn't be tripping over roots, and decided to keep walking. They just kept trying to flashlight whatever was ahead of them. Once they began walking again, they could hear it start walking too. The footsteps were heavy and the distance was just too far ahead to get the flashlights on it. When they would stop and whisper about this animal, it would stop, then start again after they would start walking. It was really getting a little creepy. And then, at around mile 4, this bear, they presume, walks off the trail to its left and into the woods. The sound was definitely that of a very heavy animal. From what they could tell is that it went about 100 feet or so into the woods and stopped. Their hesitancy to continue was really bugging them, but they began to walk again. They never heard anything else from that point on and made it to the cabin, ate, talked, and joked about it, set their alarms, and went to bed. Now, on Saturday morning, Baxter got up and went outside to relieve himself and was immediately dumbfounded. There were moose droppings out in front of the cabin. There are no moose on Admiralty Island. Baxter had thought to himself, this trip is beginning to feel very surreal. The other two guys decided they would hunt together and head for a ridgeline behind the cabin in a northern direction. Baxter planned to go alone, always hunts alone anyway, across the lake to a ridgeline south of the cabin. When they split up, it was now around 7:30 a.m. Baxter took one of the cabin boats across the lake and up to a small ridge right from the bank of the river. Right when this little ridge was ending into a flat area, something to the left of Baxter made noise, and when he looked there was a moose about 100 yards away. Of course, common sense said, do not shoot it or you may become the most hated man in Southeast Alaska. He learned later that Fish and Game had captured a moose on Douglas Island in Juneau and transplanted it on Admiralty at Admiralty Cove the year before. Why put it on Admiralty? Didn't make sense. It must be the loneliest moose on the planet. Baxter then crossed the flats heading towards the ridgeline where he wanted to hunt. To get up to the ridgeline, Baxter would have to climb the slope of this mountain to an elevation of around 3,000 feet and continue on the ridge walking uphill. Almost near the top, while still climbing, he got up on what appeared to be a switchback trail made of dirt. He was at its lowest elevation, and to his left, it went about 25 feet, then to the right, another 25 feet to a root and a big 5 to 6 cedar tree on the left. When he got to the root and was stepping up over it, he noticed this smoothed out beige granular sand in front of the tree. After he was standing on the sand to his left, blackness then caught his eye, and in reflex, he turned with his rifle ready for a hip shot. With his peripheral vision, he thought black bear, but it was a dark hole. Under the base of the tree, a big hole had been dug out. It was probably about 3.5 feet wide and about 2.5 to 3 feet tall and about 3 feet deep. It was freshly dug. This hole was between two roots with an area of about 5 feet wide at the tree and fanned out from there between two big roots. Baxter noticed how smooth the sand was, and his footprints were being made in it. He moved to the second root, and on the other side of where large footprints, big footprints, the sole of his boot is 12 inches. He stepped on one of the print's heel to heel, and it was 16 inches long and about 6 to 6.5 inches wide. Within seconds of stepping into this print, Baxter looks up and could see over this draw filled with adler trees. About 100 feet away from Baxter, the top of an adler tree began to shake and violently move back and forth. Baxter would say that this tree was around 35 to 45 feet tall, with a trunk of maybe 8 inches in diameter. It was the back and forth shaking that really caught his attention, so Baxter exclaimed to himself, "Man, that takes hands," because at that point he was completely freaked out, and he was starting to move now downhill away from it. And he could hear all this crashing as whatever it was went uphill and away from him. All the crashing ended in about a minute or less, and he never saw what it was because the brush and trees were simply too thick. He never stopped moving and going back the way he came. He made it back to the cabin right around 1 p.m., and his hunting partners were already at the cabin. They told him that there were no deer up where they went and didn't think there would be any deer in this area anyway. So Baxter tells them that something freaked him out where he had gone and generally what had happened. Baxter and friends decide to cut the trip short and pack up the gear. They left that afternoon and stayed at the Admiralty Cove Trailhead cabin because it was getting dark. They got back home on Sunday afternoon on the 26th. Baxter has shared his story with some people from time to time, but mainly keeps it to himself. Whatever they thought about it, or Baxter, didn't seem to show much from them, so who knows. Baxter did not go deer hunting again until October of 2000 with 4 other people in Seymour Canal on Admiralty Island. Baxter got 2 deer on that trip, but felt so uncomfortable in the woods alone. He has not hunted since then and don't think he ever will. He's always on edge in the woods when he's alone and even with a friend or two during a hike. So, as to what it was he encountered, it's hard to truly say what it was. The footprints were definitely real and most likely in a place nobody would have ever been to. His opinion is that he had encountered a Sasquatch on the mountainside. What was on the trail is up in the air to him. It could have been a bear, but the problem with the bear opinion is how heavy the footsteps were. A bear's gliding walk generally does not make much noise. So I'll leave it up to you guys. What do you guys think of Baxter's story? This third story was submitted by an anonymous person. This story was told to them by their former son-in-law in mid-December 2013. Their wife, 14-year-old stepdaughter, and them were up visiting their daughter in south central Oklahoma from central Texas, giving her Christmas presents and stuff for her first child, a daughter. His daughter and son-in-law lived with his grandparents out in the middle of nowhere, about 3 miles off a state road on property where the house sat, about a 4th mile off the secondary road. And they lived about 50 miles north of Thackerville, where what they would later find out is where Brown Springs Road is located, and the area is well known for sightings. As they're hanging out with their daughter, her husband had come home from work and joined in the conversations and was visiting along. Now about 10 minutes goes by, and he hears his daughter say to him, "Tell Dad about it." She wasn't done with her sentence, but that caught the dad's attention and he was bracing for something crazy, like the son or husband was going to tell him they were into BDSM or threesomes or something else crazy, right? Well, as that thought went through the dad's mind, his daughter finished her sentence with, "He'll believe you." This, of course, perked the dad's interest as responded with, "Believe what?" His daughter's husband began to tell him how his daughter and a friend of theirs was coming home from a movie 3 weeks before. It was about 9:30 p.m., with overcast sky making the area pitch black, with the only light sources on the secondary being about 2 or 3 houses that were scattered down the secondary road. They turned left or east into the driveway, which was pretty dirt ruts from tires with grass in the middle, and the lights from his grandparents' house about a 1/4 mile drive, and he claims that they were about halfway down the drive when there was a cluster of trees that sat maybe 2 or so feet off the passenger's side facing south. Now, this is when something huge stepped out from the tree line and planted its foot on the driver's side of the car, right in the driveway. It had black hair with patches of gray, very massive, and so close to the car, the headlights only illuminated up to its shoulder, as it did not see its head. He guessed it was at least 8 feet tall, and the incident took maybe 3 seconds as it ran past the car, heading northbound across a field, moving faster than anything living they had ever seen in the darkness. The dad looks at his daughter, and she was terrified as her husband was telling their story, and he seemed uneasy talking about it. The dad was stunned and asked his daughter if they told the grandparents about this, and they said yes, but the granddad said he didn't believe them, while he seemed irritated by the story. So the dad walked into the living room and began to ask the granddad about it, and the granddad was like, "Yeah, all 3 of them came in here and telling what they saw, and I told them they were just saying things." So then the dad told him, well, if they were just saying things, who could all of them see the same thing? And at that moment, the granddad looked at him almost angry and muttered something about he thought he had more common sense than that. The granddad's wife was sitting right there the whole time, not saying a word, which the dad thought was weird because the woman always had something to say about everything. She, of all people, probably knew. She was full-blooded Chickasaw, which made him remember a show he had seen on the Travel Channel called Bigfootville, where they apparently talked to some Native Americans, and one of the people that was interviewed on the show said that some of the tribes will not speak of Bigfoot for fear of them showing up. And one of these segments on the show was about 45 miles from where they lived in Oklahoma. Anyway, later on, the daughter seemed still a little shaken up about reliving the whole story, and so the father tried to talk to her about it again about a month or so later. And she was having none of it, saying she's still scared to talk about it, to think about it. She doesn't even want to discuss it anymore. And even as the years progressed, she would ignore any questions. And while the dad doesn't ultimately know what they saw, but he just knows they're scared and definitely saw something due to how terrified they were when his daughter and husband were both terrified by telling the story, and the fact they won't even talk about it all these years later. Sebastian's story happened to him nearly 20 years ago when he used to live in Puerto Rico. He was 17 at the time and lived with his parents. For a little bit of background information, his parents owned a house in a small town in what would be considered a suburban area. The house didn't have a garage, and the only vehicle they had was Sebastian's dad's, and he would always park his car in the side of the house, which had a clear view of the backyard where there were trees, and behind that was an empty field. So Dad would always come home around 6 or 7 p.m. and always park his vehicle there. This detail is important for later. Now, around the time, there weren't smartphones or anything like that, so their way of socializing before the media became the new thing, his neighbors and friends used to hang out at his place a lot. In fact, most times, they would sit at night in front of the house, which would face the street, and just talk about school and whatever video games they were into at the time. This usually would be for a while longer on weekends since they didn't have to worry about school the following morning. Now, on this particular night, for some reason, Sebastian couldn't exactly remember why his father wasn't home yet, but there was an empty space there where his car would usually be, where he parked, which allowed him and his friends to see the backyard of the house while they were talking from the front side of the house. Now, his friend, whom he referred to as Kay for the story, was there with him, talking as per usual, waiting for the rest of the friends to arrive that night. It was probably right around 7 p.m., and it wasn't too dark yet when they were both in the middle of their conversation. Sebastian stops and interrupts his friend. He freezes immediately as he was looking towards the backyard up in one of the trees. Now, at first, he thought he saw someone on one of the tree branches, but the thing was so animalistic looking, and the more Sebastian stared at it, the more disturbed he was now becoming, because he realized this could not be a person. The eyes of this thing were red and like nothing he had ever seen before. It had a distinct glow to it, and as crazy as it sounds, the best description he could give was a monkey-faced creature, but with wings. This thing was at least 5 feet crouching in the tree branches, so there's no telling how truly tall it was. Sebastian at the time was so shocked that he was seeing this, but whatever this thing was, it wasn't moving or doing anything other than staring back in their direction. So Sebastian quietly, but without taking his eyes off of his friend, asked him, "Kay, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And please, if you do, tell me, what does it look like?" And Sebastian had to ask without telling him what he was seeing out of fear that he was the only person seeing it, which I guess in hindsight would have been a good thing because that means it wouldn't have been real. But to Sebastian's horror, his friend responded, "I see a freaking monkey face with red eyes and wings." And that's the moment Sebastian felt a chill run through his body because he realized how real this thing was now. And out of fear, him and his friend rushed inside the house, closed the door behind them, and his mom was there sitting in the living room, giving them a strange look. Now, one quick thing you need to know about Sebastian's family is they were not strangers to the paranormal and weird sightings, but that is, of course, another story for another day. And this was definitely something different than anything the family had ever experienced at the time. As Sebastian told his mom what they had seen, she looked at him and looked at Kay's face, and that was all she needed to see and believe them. None of them ever dared to investigate for how scared they were. And Sebastian and his friend or family never saw this thing again after that night. To this day, he has no idea what this thing was, what it wanted, or why it was there, since they didn't own any pets. He doesn't think this was the infamous chupacabra, since the physical features of this thing didn't look too typical to the description, but he's sure glad he is no longer there to potentially see this thing again. Casey's story deals with wendigos. Casey's brother and him were out camping at a lake that you're technically not allowed to camp at. Now, this lake is in a small town called West Point in the Blue Mountains of California. As the crow flies, it's only about 60 to 70 miles away from Yosemite National Park. Now, at about 2 or 3 in the morning, Casey woke up and his first thought was, "It's a wendigo. I have to stay still." At that point, he had never heard of it before, so he didn't know what it was or why he was thinking this thought, but he knew they were safe because they were sleeping in the cab of an S10 pickup that had a back seat, so they were able to lay the front seats down. Now, the next morning, when Casey and brother woke up, he brought it up to the brother about how he had woke up the night before, and he was just as confused as Casey was. They both brushed it off at the time, not thinking much of it. And a few months later, they went camping again close to the same area. This time, though, his brother in the cab of the truck, and he simply draped a tarp over the bed and slept in there, in the back. At about the same time in the morning, around 2 or 3, before he woke up this time, it wasn't simply thoughts popping up in his head waking him up. This time it was because something was bouncing the truck, like somebody was pushing up and down on the tailgate of the truck, or like somebody was trying to bounce in the bed. At first, he thought it was his brother trying to mess with him, but then realized that he never heard the truck door open or close. The next morning, they both almost at the same time told each other, "Nice try," thinking that the other was trying to scare each other. That's when they decided to look up what a Wendigo was, and that it felt very similar to the other stories of encounters, except they didn't smell anything, they didn't hear any voices. In fact, they didn't hear anything at all the entire time. And so now Casey and brother is wondering if it had something to do with 2 serial killers possibly around that area. Is it possible that something evil was lurking in the shadows that night, and Casey's gut instinct had roused him from a sleep to protect him, or was he simply overly paranoid and somebody was really just trying to mess with him, shaking the bed of the truck? If it was something from the dark, why didn't it do more? I'd love to know your guys' thoughts and opinions on today's stories in the comments down below. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and smack that like button to see more content just like today's. And as always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next episode.